Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Venture Stories by Village Global. I'm here today with Lawson Baker, head of special projects at TokenSoft, and also working on a new project called Relay Zero. Lawson, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks, Eric. Appreciate it. So just a quick disclaimer. All of these opinions are mine.
Of course.
None of this is legal advice, financial advice, et cetera, et cetera. It does not reflect TokenSoft views or any of our customers.
So, Lawson, what are you most excited about in the crypto space right now, and how did you get to where you are right now?
Sure. So I'm super excited in this idea that Bitcoin started both a revolution in money, but also in like how we coordinate work. So my background is was obsessed with the stock market from 13, 14, started reading Money Magazine, decided I wanted to kind of have a different route into investment banking, went to law school to get an investment banking job, originating like fixed income bonds and leases for about 4 or 5 years. Realized I was renting my time and was more interested in like opportunities to invest my time and looking for equity in startup. And so I joined a company called Synapse Pay, which is now Synapse FI, which is a banking API company. And their first product market fit was essentially an ACH API and KYC and AML API, basically money movement and know your customer and anti-money laundering. In 2014, both APIs were new and there were no banking APIs. And so our first customers ended up being cryptocurrency exchanges. And as a result, basically had one foot in fintech and one foot in like this other new revolution. In that process, I started to realize that the banking APIs definitely felt like this bridge technology to something else. And that was definitely what was happening in the cryptocurrency space. And also was learning a whole lot to see what was the underside of crypto, which is the banking connection. A lot of exchanges at the time didn't know how to manage risk and manage fraud, but there was definitely something really exciting that was going on there. And so from there, I ended up leaving Synapse to start a project I called Relay Zero. Around this idea, looking for like what are the like fundamental problems in the space, and if you were to look at like really zoom way out, like what is like the 10-year narrative, the 20-year narrative, the long run narratives. In that process, I joined on at TokenSoft, head of special projects. We call it Project Zero, which is essentially like what do we think the future of security tokens will look like in the future? To me, the future of security tokens is essentially two things. You have tokenizing traditional finance, and then you have these other assets. The other assets for me is definitely like this idea of like how can you allocate capital on chain or secured by chain to demonstratable cash flows on chain or secured by the chain, which from a big picture standpoint is really like the entire service is supported by or is the chain. And, so I was listening to one of your podcasts recently, with the pioneer guy, Daniel Gross. That one was really kind of a good one for me because it's just like, how do you coordinate people online to do things and like create competition and as a result produce a new service? Now, there's clearly no crypto involved with that, but it's definitely an interesting idea of like coordinating people.
Yeah. Let's go back to security tokens for a second. When you think about the future, tokenizing non-finance assets, what are some examples or use cases? Like what could that look like in a concrete way?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess it's good to start with first what is like the security tokens for traditional finance. The way I describe like tokenizing, like let's just say Facebook, for example. Tokenizing Facebook is kind of like PDF in the New York Times to get it on the internet in the 90s. You effectively got the news and the internet, but you probably haven't used the technology to its capability. The news and the internet is probably something like Twitter and Medium and like what's happening with even podcasts now, right? Around that idea, like, these opportunities to allocate capital towards demonstratable cash flows on chain. The very first version of this on-chain cash flow was Bitcoin and proof of work. In that scenario, you just have essentially the revenue of the business online, which is the block reward, the Bitcoin reward. But the rest of the business lives offline, the miners and things like that. I think as we see these things start to evolve, we're starting to see different types of work solving for different types of problems, but definitely trying to incentivize workers to provide some sort of trust minimized service that relates to the internet.
Yeah. And why is trust minimization so important?
Trust minimization is very important when you look at the entire narrative of the internet. So like the narrative of the internet, as I see it, is essentially this. So first, in 1969, we had DARPA grant, and we started connecting a whole bunch of computers on the West Coast in the U.S. And in that time frame, it was pretty much for super technical people to jump from server to server to server. Between servers, you kind of knew there was actually an internet phone book. And so that happened for about 25 years. We were figuring out how to connect the pipes and the funnels and move all the information around. During that time frame, we started to realize you can move information cheaply and free-ish. And then as we move through that, you get to Netscape, 1994. And it was the first time non-technical people had this portal to look into this information on the internet. And then at that time, you would go to villageglobal.com. You'd look at some information, you'd probably click a link, and you'd bounce to another website and bounce to another website, bounce to another website, because there was no real great way to find the information. Google said, that's not great, let's index the information for you. And then in the early 2000s, we had a whole lot of interesting social experiments, what do people look like when they organize themselves? And so we had Facebook and Twitter, and we started to look how did people who know each other pass around information. And then in 2008, 2009, we started having a lot of interesting experiments with strangers and bringing trust to strangers. The most popular ones were Airbnb and Uber. And those were platforms that essentially connected strangers to pass around information. That information was a work order. Right smack dab in the middle, when both of those were created, we also got Bitcoin. And it connected strangers as well, except for the first time it allowed us to pass around trust minimized information. And that information ended up being money at first. And so you asked, why is the trust minimized part of information important? It's important because, at the end of the day, the internet is passing around information for us, and we haven't been able to always trust the person passing it around. Right. And so basically, it's a combination of where does cryptography meet game theory to encourage actors to be good, and as a result, make it statistically very hard to not be trust minimized information.
So let's say we're 10 years from now doing this podcast again, and you say the same framework. If I'm to summarize the start of the internet, starts in 1969 with DARPA, how do you describe the last 10 years?
Yeah, so the last 10 years is really interesting. Everything post Bitcoin has really been in this generalized money bucket and trying to solve for something that Bitcoin doesn't do today but could maybe in the future. So scalability, privacy, fungibility. And then you have this money plus bucket. Ethereum was the most obvious first money plus bucket. It was both this thing that looked like money, but also this thing that was trying to deliver trust in what they call smart contracts. But really what that means is this thing you can develop against, and it will always do the same thing, regardless. And so what that essentially allows for developers to do today, if you believe it won't be forked out or won't be broken by a future upgrade, you can essentially deploy applications for technical people on Ethereum that in theory could exist forever. And that's a pretty powerful idea. I think what we've learned from Ethereum's infrastructure that maybe the implementation is not the right one, but the idea that you could deploy something that can continue to exist and be supported by third parties without them being able to censor it is pretty powerful. And so I think Chris Dixon said it the best is trust minimization is a new software primitive. It will definitely start with developers wanting to develop and replace certain parts of internet infrastructure. Handshake's a good example. Handshake is essentially a protocol that is trying to deliver trust at what's called the DNS layer of the internet, which is literally the pipes and the funnels. When you type in Lawson.com, how do you get to the IP address of the servers? That resolves that. And right now, that's the central constraint point in the internet. What they're trying to do with Handshake is bring what the trust minimization that Bitcoin gave to resolving where to get to the right address and the right location of your service. Yeah. It just comes down to the base layers of the internet. This money plus bucket to me is starting to look a lot more like a microservice for the internet rather than just generalized money. Right. So 10 years from now, I think this is again on a very long time horizon. But it's definitely starting to replace key constraint points of the internet that are being constrained today, censored today, et cetera, A good example of that is AirTM is being blocked in Venezuela, and so people are trying to get access to this server, this app, or Signal is being blocked by how many different countries in the world. There are both software solutions for certain parts of that, of how to get around that, but I think we really just need to look at like how the internet is put together today, and as a result, like what could be different.
Yeah, there are people who say that Bitcoin to be great digital gold, it has to make certain trade-offs that will prevent it from being, say, hey, to bring the cliche phrase, a world computer. And there are other people that say, no, everything that's working elsewhere will eventually be adopted within Bitcoin via some mechanisms. Where do you fall in that debate?
It's kind of like saying we're not going to have the newspaper anymore. Like the newspaper still exists. We still have tons of centralized providers on the internet because they will provide value for certain types of services. But I think we'll start to see trends towards certain types of services that otherwise weren't either socially acceptable, maybe legal in one country, but okay in another country, or just like people want control of their stuff. And so like social media applications are starting to censor people's activity. You either just have to get a new platform that likes your activity, or just change the way you interact with your information.
But even within sort of decentralized world, do you think that there will be a one coin or one project winner take all, or will, how many winners will there be? Or what type will the ecosystem look like?
So in the money bucket, in the money only bucket, I think those would be one or a grouping of types of money. But as I mentioned before, these are something else besides this money. We're redefining what money is and what organizations look like. Right. I'll give you kind of the story of like the story of like organizations. So in the 1600s, we had the Dutch East Indian Tea Company. This was like a quasi-governmental, quasi-private organization that essentially was the first organization to issue shares and bonds to third-party investors. And so what it essentially did is it abstracted this layer away of like third-party capital allocators can give capital to workers to provide a service that will be given to consumers of that service, and as a result, pay back the workers and extract outward to these investors. And so that was like super powerful. That led to the capital markets revolution we have today. That's exactly why we have capital markets today. Eventually that was like that. First it started off as this like quasi-governmental organization, and then it just went more towards private organizations, and states started recognizing that. And so where that essentially takes us is I believe cryptocurrencies are protocols that basically remove the need for a Delaware C Corp to provide services on the internet. And so that's a pretty, I believe, a pretty powerful like idea that like you can create rules to incentivize workers to provide a service and never need a Delaware C Corp to do it. And then the whole group of people wanted to say, okay, cool, then like you created a partnership and now everybody's liable for it. And so like, yeah, maybe. But we also have like a lot of these really powerful privacy tools. And so basically like both the privacy tools and cryptography that we have, in addition to the incentive mechanisms we have, will start to replace the need for this idea of a corporation to like coordinate workers.
It's the same question for 10 years from now. How will it have played out in terms of what organizations will look like?
I think we're going to see a lot of new experiments with trying to solve for these internet problems. So a lot of the problems that we're seeing are going towards like basically a trend back towards this peer-to-peer type of internet we had. At the very beginning, internet, it was very peer-to-peer, server-to-server, and then we started going from peer to cloud, like Google, and back down to peer. I think 10 years from now, it'll start to look like peer-to-peer, except we're interacting with layers of distributed services, in addition to, in some cases, centralized clouds. Right. And so it's a layering. And so that's why when I said microservices, one of these alone is not enough to provide a complete service. Right. For example, if you were to deploy a DAO or a smart contract on Ethereum, very few people would be able to access that. Because you still need a website, you still need servers, all of these other types of things up and down the stack have to be solved for. 10 years from now, we'll start to layer these types of services together to create new types of services and applications.
Yeah. But on a company level or organizational level, will we still have the same hierarchies that we have today and make decisions based on those hierarchies, or will we be using prediction markets or how do you think the standard corporation itself will evolve?
I mean, the standard corporation will continue for probably hundreds of years from now. I just don't think it's required for certain types of work. Like, I don't think these protocols are right for everything. Yeah. There must be a lot at stake in the work, right, and or a scale like not previously thought about. The internet definitely told us that scale of organizations is like completely different. This is why the most valuable companies in the world are centralized, internet providers. Right. I think we'll start to see that type of scale exist in other types of services, but 10 years from now, it's not going to be a complete application for consumers.
Right. And you talk about how, going back to the beginning of the podcast, you're excited about future of money, but also the future of coordinated work and how crypto enables that. Say more about that, what that could look like and where you're most excited within there. Another way of asking, if you were starting a fund focused on the crypto space, how might you think about what types of projects will emerge that you think will capture a lot of value?
Yeah, I mean, so the question of if I were starting a fund is a very interesting one, because I think that's very much a function of how, if we look back at how most people have been holding these assets, so both wallets, custodial wallets, to exchanges, to even funds, most people have been holding these things passively. As these little things and little rubies or pieces of gold, they're going to make me money in the future. And to me, that just doesn't make a lot of sense. To me, these are vehicles for new economic activity. And in those vehicles for new economic activity, the passive holder, this third party, value extractor probably will underperform, this active worker, and this active investor. And so, what we'll see out of that and what Relay Zero is basically software-based venture funds. And basically this idea, that, you must be a worker in these protocols to, actually extract the value. Without, quote, being a worker, then there's probably a less of a reason to passively be in it, or at least the incentives are lower.
Right. So what might the implications of that be in terms of where value is created and captured?
Yeah, so this kind of goes towards this de-evolution of the firm. In the idea of a firm, you basically had this incentive protocol, that the fiduciary duty of the board was to the investors to produce a profit. And that protocol was always incentivizing doing things more efficiently, having proprietary secrets, having IP, having patents to extract value better than their competitors. In the world of the internet, and especially in open source protocols, there is no IP. It exists. It's all open. The secret sauce is not in the open source. The secret sauce is how you incentivize your community. Right. And that community is both users and workers, less so this passive holder. Right. And so, these users and workers will, start to be able to participate in the success of their use or work. So I wrote this, spec of a gambling DAO called Baba Fa, with another guy named Patrick Kershaw, who's my partner with Relay Zero. And most of that is his brainchild. But in Baba Fa, basically, it's this idea of a gambling DAO, where the user is a player, the user is a worker, and the user also is the shareholder. And passively holding of what we call Card 8 or the token in it is essentially, disincentivized. You must always be contributing back to the organization. I think that's a baby idea of something much larger that, because these won't need a Delaware C Corp, and as a result don't need outside investors, all of the value will accrue back to the users or the workers.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so for the audience, DAOs stand for Decentralized Autonomous Organizations. Where do you think will be the first use cases that really take off?
Gaming. Gaming, gambling. FOMO 3D was essentially this project released by a bunch of anonymous developers. It looked like a lottery. It also looked like a Ponzi scheme, but it used something called a bonding curve to incentivize both the early user and the later user. In a bonding curve, the early user is incentivized to give put money into this lottery, because they can win right then. But they also have their buyout price, increases as the second and third and the fourth user comes in after them. So that sounds like a multi-level marketing scheme or a Ponzi scheme. But when you look at it, it's really just a better lottery. You basically know exactly how much money is in there, and you know how much you can win at any time. And there's no extraction for higher education or whatever lottery proceeds are used for. And so personally, I'm super excited about like, what do, these organizations look like in gaming and gambling? Yeah. Because I think in those areas is where we're playing with this idea, kind of like Pioneer, where we're like, we're trying to get people excited about doing something. Right. So CAPTCHA is when you're trying to log into a website and it thinks you're a bot. It says like, hey, show me all the cars. That was a solution to like get rid of bots on websites, but it was also like getting people to give free work, like train, machine learning algorithms how to identify cars. Incredibly exciting. So there's another game that one of my old roommates used to play with, called Ingress. Ingress is like this game where like two, I think it's red and blue team go around like the city of San Francisco, and you're literally in an alley fighting over control of this alley. And I think there's really something really incredible in this idea of like this game and this user in this specific organization doing something. They don't necessarily realize it, but like, I think some of that stuff can end up being work. I was traveling, every time I travel, I just love like watching like, not love watching it, but like it's hard not to notice in all of these different countries, people do have smartphones. They have access to the internet. It's almost like a lot of wasted labor. People in a variety of second and third world countries, don't always have opportunities to always be working. Yeah. And so as a result, they're kind of just like, hanging out in the corner store in the bodega on their phone. And a lot of times they're playing games or doing something on social media. And like, I believe there's a huge opportunity to keep helping them play games, but, they're going to end up being able to do a little work along the way. And in large populations, that work will end up, with the right incentives, being able to, I think, solve for different types of work and trust. This
is what Earn.com was trying to do in some capacity.
Yeah. So
the vision of it. Maybe they did different use case.
That idea of like being able to perform work for an email is very interesting. I think you have to think a little deeper of like why you would do it. You can't just strap a token on every business model. Like, you must be doing something fundamentally different. For me, like, successful cryptocurrencies are vehicles for new economic activity, not previously possible. That economic activity will 99% of the time be internet based. And in that world, like, you need to be solving for a problem that exists on the internet. Right. We already have spam filters, so I don't know if that was maybe that's a solution later on, but I don't know if we're there for that to be the problem yet.
If you were starting a company in that space, what the use case might?
No, but I like to talking with lots of great groups and then maybe help fund them do it.
Yeah. So is that what you're trying to do with Relay Zero? Relay Zero, is that?
Yeah. So Relay Zero, as I mentioned, is a software-based venture fund all around this idea that we will invest in the future of work and these incentives, and we will do that by deploying software to perform the protocol level work or the work of these tools built on top of even core level, base level protocols. And so what that essentially is like it's economic arbitrage meets software development. It's quantitative analysis meets trading, meets putting together an algorithm to perform a work a little bit better than another worker. At the very simplest level, like an idea of like work as proof of work or even staking. Staking's not very interesting to me. I believe the more interesting types of work will be the more complex type of work, curation, Oracle type work. I think those are like definitely unsolved computer science problems and like incentive problems. But we're seeing a lot of interesting experiments around that with Augur and things like that. Those are the most interesting types of work that I think will over an extended period of time continue to have value for the workers.
Yeah. What do you think about the state of prediction markets and how that will evolve over time?
Prediction markets are incredibly exciting. Augur is incredibly exciting. I think we're still trying to figure out how to get the users to come into those markets. I also believe no one's actually solved the Oracle problem. I asked this question on Twitter recently, like, what's your favorite Oracle project? a lot of people had a lot of answers, but I don't. A lot of people had great answers of what they thought was the best project, but nobody could answer why. I literally was just trying to say, like, how can a system, a protocol that's encouraging oracles to deliver information on a bet, it doesn't have all the information. Basically, like, you could care less if you were going to attack the system with incorrect information, because all of this stuff is offline. And as a result, you don't have all the information to incentivize the oracle. And so, like, oracles will always trend towards, could trend towards being malicious if they wanted to, because all of the information is not there to properly incentivize them to be a good actor or a bad actor.
So what do you think it's going to take for this to go mainstream?
Oracle, continued work, smart teams working on a very hard problem. I think that'll be like probably still easily another multi-decade problem that I think will continue to exist.
So no government's run by prediction markets anytime soon.
No. I think Oracle, the Oracle problem is akin to tokenizing traditional finance. Like tokenizing traditional finance is definitely grabbing this offline asset and trying to put a token on it. Oracles are grabbing this offline information and trying to solve for it a little too much with this online world. Right. And I think that problem is hard for both for the same reason, or similar reasons. Yep.
What about identity and reputation?
Yeah, so identity, reputation is incredibly interesting to me. I believe we're trending towards this, as I mentioned, this peer-to-peer type of internet, where, in my belief, identity and certain portions of the services are local. And so interesting ideas with identity that I'm following right now is Blockstack, and this idea that identity is local, but the applications are distributed, and so they're putting together kind of interesting tools around that. But you also have things like Keybase. Keybase is PGP key management strapped on top of like this social validation. So, like, I have a very active Twitter account. I have an active Hacker News account, and I can also prove my website at the DNS. It's this idea that, like, you can both attach this identity to this socially proved identity, these social networks, GitHub, Twitter, whatever, with this local identity, which is like my private keys. Yeah. I think this is a very interesting idea in what Keybase is, or even what Blockstack is.
There's this narrative that says we started out on the internet, we went from anonymous to pseudonymous to all real names, and that will go back to pseudonymous and anonymous over time. 10 years from now, how are we talking about how identity and reputation has evolved on the internet?
I 100% agree with that narrative. I tweeted at the end of last year that, like, 2019, the narrative is definitely the anonymous developer and anonymous projects. FOMO 3D last year was definitely a good example of that. Grin was an example of two of the core developers were anonymous. And I believe we'll continue to see that, especially given the state of regulation. I think we're going to see a lot of people trying to deploy networks or things, DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations on top of these networks, anonymously or pseudonymous, frankly, because the technology allows them to do it, but regulation is gray or maybe doesn't allow them to do it. And so the incentive is to do it anonymously. And I think we're going to continue seeing that. This year specifically, I think that trend is kicking back off.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about when you think about the problems with there are problems with identity. One is there are many, but one is this concept of scale is really interesting. That there are certain things that were supposed to be for small groups, but then because of the internet are now at scale, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. So language, for example, has scaled in some ways really, really well. The English language, we all speak it, all understand what we're talking about. But reputation or celebrity is sort of this weird thing where our software says that if we're shamed by one group, it's, could potentially be killed. Whereas today, and if you're shamed by one group, you could just go to another group, and there's millions of other groups you can go at, but we still operate on the same sort of survival software. So there's sort of a problem around celebrity in that it doesn't really scale, super well. What's your take on that?
So let me make sure I understand your question or comment. What you're trying to say is because of the scale of the internet, an internet celebrity trying to scale ends up being attacked at a scale we've never seen before. Is that
there are sort of negative externalities of having one name and being able to contact people at scale or communicate with people at scale, unintended consequences that we didn't foresee.
I personally have dealt with this before. I have a quasi popular Twitter account, but not that many followers, 4,000. It's very exciting to put out information that people care about and want to talk about, debate about, and they end up following you because you're putting some sort of thought out there that is interesting to them. But as that grows, you start to have more and more people who will disagree with you as well. And so I personally dealt with that with the Ripple trolls on Twitter. I was kind of one of the early ones to identify how do you basically look at a quote cryptocurrency post launch and is it a security or is it not a security? I used to think I was the most hated person probably top 5 most hated person by Ripple Twitter. But then somebody made a Dungeons and Dragons fork to go around and kill all the Ripple fudsters. And I was the final dragon for them to kill.
Wow.
And so I may be one of the higher up than I thought I was.
Wow.
That was a very proud moment that someone randomly on the internet had made me a dragon in a forked game.
You never know what you mean to other people.
Yeah. But that being said, I've almost had my phone ported. I've had people in my direct messages literally give me death threats. It's you kind of want to aid on an account because of that. I try to treat everybody fairly and have civil discussions and not use names when I talk about things. But not everybody has the same rules and cool, that's them. But you kind of have to deal with that if you're a public face.
Right.
I think there's something, I haven't really thought about it in the context that you have. The popularity doesn't scale on the internet because of the nature of the internet, being able to do things at such rapid pace.
Yeah. Well, something scale. I mean, you can get your message out. There are a lot of positive consequences, but there's sort of unintended consequences that people sort of opt out. Like Mark Andreessen doesn't tweet anymore. Balaji doesn't. There are a bunch of people just opt out, and that's sort of a deadweight loss to society in some ways. Another example of just things not porting at scale is for example, what do gun regulation laws mean in a world of 3D printing guns? Or free speech regulations, before the internet, after the internet, and then, soon to be a decentralized internet, because, you still have Twitter, Facebook, banning people and such. What does that look like? You have a law background?
Yeah.
Of course, your name is Lawson. How can you not have a law background? But it's just interesting how the law needs to evolve or will evolve or won't evolve.
That's kind of my central premise is you can't stop the internet. The same is true with gun laws, and 3D printed guns is true with cryptocurrencies. You can try to turn these things off, but just by the nature of how the internet is structured, it's very hard. There's definitely central constraint points, and that's part of what I'm talking about that the most interesting cryptocurrency protocols for me are trying to solve for. This is part of an evolution of when there are people who don't want you to do something, people will figure out how to do something if there's enough incentives. That has occurred pre-internet and will occur on the internet. It's just happening at a scale we've never thought possible. I think I mentioned this before the podcast or in the show notes of this, the 4chan anonymous poster who solved this incredible mathematical problem that nobody had solved before. Ended up getting cited in the paper, in a research paper by people in universities. It was the very first author, which is the first author is really for the first person who did it. I think that's just powerful. There are people in forums discussing everything and debating. And some of that will be very productive. We will create things we've never created before just by the nature of more people talking about it. And it also being indexed. It's there kind of forever. And so if every conversation if every person ever had was indexed, that would be scary and that's horrible for privacy. But it also, the other side of that is the stuff that is indexed, could be very powerful to solve something we haven't been able to solve before. Yeah. Or identify something we haven't been able to solve before.
One other thing you've thought a lot about is the future of capitalism and how that evolves over time. And people say things like post-capitalism. People say things like, hey, we're just in the early innings of capitalism. What's your take, and what do these phrases even mean?
I love capitalism. I'll just be clear on that. So the stock market is what I was obsessed with from a very young age. I just think the corporation is crumbling in certain use cases. And I just believe it does. We don't necessarily need them anymore. It's really just this function of what are the boundaries of the internet? It's clearly global. And so like, what does like the jurisdiction of California or the US really mean to that? The same is true for corporations. Corporations are something recognized by literally a state within the United States and then recognized by the United States. And so I have to have a corporation in every country I want to operate? Like, no, you don't need them anymore. It's not that I'm anti-capitalism. It's just saying you don't need them for the internet. Right. And you don't need them.
You need markets, but not corporations.
You need markets, incentives. You need economic incentives and markets. And if you can, and that's really all that comes down to. And so there'll continue to be like huge corporations, and they'll be successful. But I think in other areas and certain types of internet related problems, we won't, because those will by default be uncompetitive to the alternative.
Right. What's your take on income share agreements?
Oh, nice. ISAs. Love ISAs. Income sharing agreements, for background, is this idea of like getting an education in say a developer's class, like a 10-course class, and they'll give it to you for free. Under the agreement that if you make a job over, say, $50,000 a year, you'll pay them back at X percentage rate capped up at, say, $30,000 in 3 years. And so that's the Lambda school model. I don't remember how long their actual program is, but this idea that like you'll pay back a percentage of your earnings to the school. But if you don't have enough earnings under the contract, you don't owe them anything. And so that's essentially the opposite of debt. It's kind of like equity in your future earnings. I think that's very powerful. I definitely am very excited about where that goes. It's also around this idea that I think like centralized education institutions are like the exact opposite of what the internet represents. And so if you can educate people like in mass online for free and also encourage, via like social coordination or social pressure for them to also make sure you get paid back. I think we'll see a lot of that continue to exist, and will grow a lot. I actually was helping someone put together kind of a DAO for ISAs recently. It was definitely a mashup of old world and new world. The old world because the workers are definitely offline, and you need like the employer to pay in Ethereum or whatever it gets built on. But this idea of a income sharing agreement DAO, where third parties can give funds to the DAO to invest in, say, like a class of 2019 computer devs from Lambda School version 2.0 or something like that. And as a result, you can basically, via a smart contract, create what's called a lockbox in legal terms, where funds come in from employer and then are distributed out first to, if it meets the rules of over 50,000 a year, whatever that equates to monthly, it can pay out both the employee prior student and either the educator or the prior investor. So I'm super excited about where those go.
Totally. So while we're conjecturing on the roles of different things, one question I have for you is, 10 years from now, how are we talking about how the role of government has evolved? And maybe, of course, that's a multi-decade thing, but how do you see that playing out in the future?
I'm probably, net bear on, the United States continue to be in a world power. I think there will be lots of offline governments that will continue to try to become the world power, and we'll see where that kind of goes. To me, I think, we kind of have two lives. The one we live when we walk down the street and the one we live online. Governments I don't think they port well to online. Right. And so this idea of governments today is like, is definitely like social media deciding what can be posted or whatnot. I think corporations right now are essentially our only version of internet governments. And that's a problem. And so that's kind of what these protocols are solving for. Yeah. Offline governments, like, I don't know, I'm not going to conjecture whether it'll be war or not, but, I don't think offline governments are competitive on the internet is what it comes down to.
And what will be replaced and what will replace them?
How do people organize themselves? We're seeing how people organize around like whatever their interests are. Yeah. And many times they live multiple lives in multiple groups. For example, like I could be in a biohacking group under this pseudonym or my real name and contributing this way, which is different from how I contribute on Twitter and predominantly a cryptocurrency narrative. Right now, those governments are definitely the controllers of the platform. I don't think that's always going to be true.
It goes back to identity, sort of philosophical point, which is I have different facets of myself and I engage in different ways, and they should be treated differently.
Yeah, and if you break that fourth wall in the wrong forum, I did this recently. Like if I want to write poetry on my Twitter, that's not what people follow me. Yeah. And like they literally will unfollow you or tell you, why are you talking about poetry?
You keep that to yourself.
Yeah, it's like people have multiple lives. They just display them in different areas for different reasons in different ways.
Yeah. I would read your poetry Twitter. I write poems too.
Oh, cool. We can share some next time.
Totally. Lawson, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for coming on the podcast. For people who want to learn more about your work, where can you point them to? And any last plugs?
Yep. So I'm LWSN Baker, Baker, on Twitter and on Medium. That's where I talk about predominantly like cryptocurrencies and the future of work and incentives. And then also you can find TokenSoft at tokensoft.io. TokenSoft is a white label software platform for helping companies doing token sales in addition to custody assets. Or you can also find my newest project, RealizeZero.com, zero spelled out, which is a software-based venture fund.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lawson. If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Please hit us up at villageglobal.vc/network catalyst.